In this nugget, we're going to discuss and demonstrate working with data stores, which are either local or network-based storage that an ESXi host can use to support VMs and the files supporting those virtual machines. Let's begin. As you and I deploy virtual machines inside of a vSphere environment, one of the questions that comes up is where exactly do the files for each of the virtual machines, where are they stored? Now we've already seen one of these files. That was the .vmx file for a virtual machine, and we edited that when we deployed the vCenter Server appliance inside of VMware Workstation. And in addition to the VMX file, there's a boatload of other files, including files that represent the virtual hard disk for a virtual machine that need to be stored somewhere. So the question comes up, where do you suppose the ESXi host is going to store those virtual machines files? And the answer is in the data stores. And so by default, when we deployed the ESXi host 1 and ESXi host number 2, they both have a local hard drive. And also, as a result, they both created a data store using the available space on their local hard drives. And they gave these data stores a name, and they simply called it Data Store. And as a result, when we brought those ESXi hosts into vCenter, vCenter now knows about these data stores that are local to ESXi1 and ESXi2. Except there was a teeny little challenge, and that is it can't have two data stores with the exact same name. So when we brought in ESXi2 into vCenter, because it also had a data store named quote unquote data store, it renamed it to data store with a parentheses 1 to make it a unique name. So if we wanted to, inside of vCenter, we could go to each of these data stores, the one associated with ESXi1 and the data store associated with ESXi2. These are both examples of local data stores. And we could rename them so that when we see them inside of vCenter, we would know exactly which data store we're looking at. So let's take a moment right now inside of vCenter and let's rename each of those data stores respectively. So here in the vSphere web client, it's really easy to take a look at our data stores. From the home page, we could go ahead and click here on the storage icon. That's one way of doing it. Or over here on the left, we could click on storage here, or we could click on the home button up here at the top, and then from here we could click on storage. So any way we want to get there is absolutely great. So we'll go ahead and click on storage. And by default in the vSphere web client, it has getting started tabs for most of the elements here inside of the vSphere web client. If we want to disable those, we simply go up here under help and then simply say please hide all the getting started pages. And that will remove those if you don't want to see them anymore. So here under the USA folder in the data center called LV Data Center-1, I've got two data stores. One is called Data Store, the other is called Data Store with a 1 in parentheses. So right off the bat, it may not be too easy to determine, okay, which data store belongs to ESXi1 and which belongs to ESXi2. And one easy way of determining that is right here is simply clicking on Related Objects. So the focal point is this data store, and then when we click on related objects, we can then select hosts. And that will show us the related host associated with that data store. So we'll go ahead and click on hosts. And this is showing us that that data store is associated with ESXi-1. So it's its local data store. Another way of seeing that same information is we could go ahead and click on the hosts and clusters icon right here, and then we could go down to ESXi1 from this view, and then from here under related objects we could go ahead and select data stores, and that would also reveal the data store that's associated with ESXi1. Another really cool feature is this. Now that we're here under related objects with the sub-tab of data store selected, if we change the focus over to ESXi2, it would show us this tab and this sub-tab associated with ESXi-2. So as an example, let's click on ESXi-2, and now it's showing us the data store associated with ESXi-2. So what I would recommend is let's rename these data stores so that when we see them, we'll know exactly whose local data store they are. So let's go back to ESXi1. We'll right click on the data store, and from the drop down, we'll simply select rename. And let's name it ESXi-1-data store. And let's go to ESXi-2, and let's rename its data store to something with ESXi-2 in it. So to do that, we'll right click on the data store. From the drop down, we'll select rename, and we'll name it ESXi-2-data store, and we'll click on OK. Also note here it has the type of data store. The VMFS is the VM file system, and if we're using network-based storage, we could still use VMFS, or we could use NFS, the network file system, if the storage device on the network is supporting the NFS protocol. So if we went back to the storage icon right here and clicked on it, it's now showing us that we have the two data stores with the names that we just assigned to those. And this is an example of how using the vSphere web client in conjunction with vCenter, we make changes here, and then it's actually vCenter that is implementing those changes on the data stores, in this example, for ESXi1 and ESXi2. So regarding data stores, it can be local to the ESXi host. For example, a hard drive directly connected to the ESXi host. It can be network-based, using a variety of technologies, for example, iSCSI or Fiber Channel. And another really cool option that we can use is something called Virtual SAN. And that's where each of the ESXi hosts takes local drives and contributes them to make a network-based available logical storage network. And we'll have separate nuggets based on network storage, including NFS, iSCSI, as well as Virtual SAN. And I remember back in the old days when Microsoft announced this brand new development called NTFS, the NT file system, which was going to be way better than the FAT file system, and it was. And in a VMware environment, the type of file system is going to be VMFS, which is the VM file system from VMware. So basically, the ESXi host is pointed to storage, and then it's going to quote-unquote format it using VMFS. And another option that we already touched on was NFS, Network File System, where if we have an appliance, for example, from EMC or some other vendor, or we have some kind of an open source file sharing service that's using NFS, we can have our ESXi host connect to that Network File System service that's being provided over the network and have our ESXi host use that as a data store. And at the end of the day, one of the primary reasons for the data store is to hold the files, including the configuration files and hard disk files for each of our VMs. And so the play-by-play would go something like this. The virtual machines believe they have hard disks, and the hypervisor is providing that as a virtual hard disk to the actual virtual machine. And then the ESXi host, working with its data stores, is responsible for the reads and the writes to those files for that virtual machine. And here's the great news. When we deploy a virtual machine on an ESXi host, the provisioning of the hard disk, the virtual hard disk that the virtual machine believes it has, that can be done using either thick, and there's a couple of flavors of thick, or thin provisioning. And here's how it works. If we have VM number 1 and we provisioned it with a 20 gigabyte hard disk, if we're using thick provisioning, at the moment that VM is created, poof, we are actually using the full 20 gigs for that virtual machine on the data store. It is consumed and not available for any other purpose. On the other hand, for VM2, when we deployed it, if we assigned it and provisioned it with a 40 gigabyte hard drive, but we used thin provisioning, what would happen on the data store with thin provisioning is that only the amount of megabytes or gigabytes that the virtual machine is actually using would be tied up on the data store. So in an example where maybe the virtual machine is only really using 20 gigs out of 40, on the data store, we're also only tying up 20 gigs. One skill that we're going to definitely want to have as we work with ESXi hosts and data stores is the ability to move files if we need to those data stores. For example, let's imagine that there's an ISO image for maybe a Linux operating system or a Windows operating system that we're going to be deploying as virtual machines inside of VMware. So as a starting point, it might be really handy for you and I if we could get that ISO image into that data store so that it could be leveraged and used from the data store. So what I'd love to do is walk you through how we can take an ISO image and put it on the data store of an ESXi host. And for this demonstration, let's go ahead and use the data store that's on ESXi 1. And to do that, we're going to use the vSphere web client. So here we are at the home page of the vSphere web client. Let's go ahead and go to storage by clicking on the storage icon. So in your environment, if you collapsed your tree here and you need to expand it, feel free to do that so you can see the data stores. As an example, let's download an ISO for Xubuntu. So I've done a Google search for Xubuntu. I'll go ahead and click on Xubuntu, xubuntu.org. I'll click on download, and then from here I'll simply download the flavor of Xubuntu that we want to use. So for example, let's get 15.04. We'll click on download, and we'll go ahead and say we're in the United States. Then we can grab the one that we want to download. So I'm going to grab the 32-bit version ISO right here. It's 970 megs, so I'll click that, and then we can go ahead and download that to our local computer. Through the magic of editing, now that file is on my local computer. Now, how do I get that ISO from my local computer where I'm currently sitting into the data store that's locally connected to ESXi 1? And the answer is we'd go to that data store. So here we've gone to storage and selected the ESXi-1 data store. And all we need to do here is simply right click on that data store and from the menu select Browse Files. So here's a folder called VCSA that the ESXi host created to be the home for the files for the virtual machine for our vCenter server appliance when we deployed it on ESXi 1. So we could actually go and take a look at those files if we wanted to, but for the moment, what I want to do is I want to create a new folder where we can place an ISO image. And the new folder isn't required, but it's nice for organization. So to create a new folder on this data store, we're going to go ahead and use this plus symbol over here with the little folder icon, which represents create a new folder. And let's name this new folder ISO-images, and we'll click on create. So now the new folder exists. Let's go ahead and click on it to enter that folder. And now with that folder selected, if we want to upload a file or files to that folder, we're going to simply click on this icon right here to upload files. So we'll click on the icon to upload a file to the data store. And here in my downloads folder, I've got the Xubuntu 15.04 desktop-i386.iso. I'm simply going to double click on that to select it, and it's now uploading. So down here there's a progress bar that's indicating exactly the status of that upload. And one of the cool things about having that ISO sitting there is that if we want to now deploy, for example, Xubuntu virtual machine, we can go ahead and define it using the vSphere web client. And then we can tell that machine that we want to use the ISO image that's already on the data store as the image that this virtual machine believes is directly connected via a CD-ROM. And then when we boot that machine for the first time, it can go ahead and launch and run the contents based on that ISO image. And then subsequently, if we wanted to, we could also do a full-blown install of that virtual machine using the Xubuntu ISO for the deployment of this virtual machine. In this nugget, we've identified that a data store is a local or network-based storage that an ESXi host can use to support the virtual machines and other files that are needed in a vSphere environment. We also identified that when deploying a virtual machine and giving that virtual machine a virtual disk, if we're using thin provisioning, our data stores are not going to have to pre-allocate the entire virtual disk space up front. And with that, let's do our assessment check. Question number 1, what are 2 locations for a data store? And if you said, well, Keith, one is local and the other is network based, you would be absolutely correct. And the virtual SAN is kind of a combination of both, where each of the ESXi hosts are chipping in some of their resources locally to create a network based virtual storage area network that multiple ESXi hosts can use. Question number 2, which provisioning uses the most data store storage space? And the choices are thin or thick. And if you said thick, you would be absolutely correct. And that's because thick provisioning ties up the entire space that's provisioned for that virtual machine the moment the virtual machine is created. Whether or not the virtual machine is using half or 20% or 70%, the entire chunk, the entire space is allocated up front with thick provisioning. Question number 3, what are 2 file system types for data stores? And VMFS is certainly one of them, and NFS is the other. So whether the data store is local or it's network based, it's going to be one of these 2 types regarding the file system. Your action items for this nugget are as follows. Number 1, I would like you to rename your data stores. For example, on ESXi1, give it a name that's representing that it's on ESXi1. That way when you see it as a data store, you'll know, oh, that's the local data store in ESXi1, and do a similar treatment for ESXi2. Secondly, I'd like you to download a 32-bit version of Xubuntu. It doesn't have to be the latest and greatest. It can be the LTS flavor. And then once you've downloaded that, my friend, to your local computer, I'd like you to upload that file into the data store on ESXi1. And go ahead and put it in a separate folder as well, just for organizational purposes. That'll give you a little more practice in working with the data store as well. And what that will do, it'll put you in great striking position for the next nugget, where we are going to deploy a virtual machine on an ESXi host. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.